welcome to Canonical. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by Iad Darris.
Hello.
Hi, Iad, and Sam Spieler.
Hi.
Hey, Sam. So today we are reviewing the third and last book in our series on race in contemporary America with Brit Bennett's second novel, The Vanishing Half. Since this is a review episode, we won't reveal any spoilers, so if you haven't read the book yet, keep on listening. If you want to join our discussion, you can find us on Reddit by searching for Canonical Pod, one word, and we are also on social media at Canonical Pod. So let's get started with The Vanishing Half. Since this is my pick for the series, I'll start with a little bit about Brit Bennett. At 30 years old, she is the youngest novelist that we've read so far for our podcast. Mandel and Orange were both in their 30s as well when their books were published. She grew up in Southern California and attended the Michigan MFA program, which is a very good program. Her first book, The Mothers, was published in 2016 to much acclaim, and this book was published earlier this year, 2020, and is probably going to be shortlisted for the big end-of-year prizes. That's my guess. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think so.
I would say so. It has some popular buzz. I don't know if the critical buzz is as strong as the popular buzz.
I think it's got a lot going for it, especially this year, 2020, with everything going on with Black Lives Matters. I think that it's the perfect year for this book in a lot of ways. It tackles a lot of difficult issues in the Black community. So I'd be surprised, actually, if it wasn't shortlisted for the Pulitzer or the National Book Award. So the novel, it tells the story of two light-skinned Black twins who run away from their home in Mallard, a small town in Louisiana that was founded for lighter-skinned Black people, former slaves during Reconstruction. One twin, Stella, discovers that she can pass for white and leaves her family behind. The other, Desiree, returns to Mallard years later with Jude, her very dark-skinned daughter. And then the latter half of the novel moves forward in time and focuses on Jude as she moves to California for college. And Stella, the twin who left the family behind, she's been passing as white, so she's also part of the second half of the novel. And also, the novel focuses on Kennedy, Stella's daughter, who was raised as a white girl. In total, the novel covers about half a century and shifts between characters and generations, from Stella and Desiree at the start, running away, to then the relationship between their daughters, Kennedy and Jude. Is there anything else you guys want to add about this book that you think we should mention?
One thing I think that's very interesting is that Bennett introduces a transsexual character, Reese, whose issue with his own personal identity is a very interesting parallel with the Black identity we see in the other characters.
Right, and Reese is the love interest of one of the twins' daughters. I guess one thing I'll add is the characters primarily are Black in this novel, with the exception of some of the people in Stella's life who, because she obviously runs away from home and passes as white. Let's do a one-sentence review of the book. Who wants to go first?
I thought this was a unique take on passing and about shedding one's past in the search for a better life at the expense of family.
I think that this novel is one of those monkey's paw sort of novels where you get your wish, but it comes with a secret curse. And I think that Stella's wish to pass came with an unexpected curse.
Do you think her decision to pass as white was a very considered decision? Because in the book, it seems to me that it was just something she kind of did on a whim. She just kind of applies for a job as a white person, and then on a whim, she just takes the next step, and then the next step, and then the next step.
Yes, but I think when he asked her to move, even though it was kind of impulsive, I got the feeling that she kind of expected it to start moving that direction. It didn't seem like she had qualms.
For me, I would say that in the novel, being white was never Stella's dream, but having a happy life was Stella's dream. And the tragedy of the novel is that for a lot of Black people, being happy often means being white.
I mean, there are advantages to not being an oppressed person.
That's an understatement, yeah.
My one sentence review, I think, is something as simply as it's an introspective intergenerational tale filled with unhappy people who are haunted by their past and past actions, which actually is what I really love about it, because I love stories about people who are haunted by what they did in the past. I think that kind of story leads to a lot of depth, and I think this novel does that really well.
I think I agree with you, but there is one exception to that rule, which is Early.
Let's explain who he is first. Yeah.
So Early in the beginning of the novel is somebody who was hired by Desiree's ex-husband to track her down, and then he ends up falling in love with Desiree, one of the twins. Early also has a troubled past, but he provides a very good counterbalance, and probably a necessary counterbalance to the other characters in the novel, in that even though he has a troubled past, it doesn't seem to bother him. He still lives a more or less happy life.
I really liked that character and wanted more of him, but maybe that's the sign of good writing, leave you wanting more, even if you don't get it.
So I'm going to give a brief review of the book. I think that, as I said before, it's an introspective novel that explores the tension between identity and heritage. And it's a novel of transformations in gender, race, and, for example, Kennedy's performances, to name a few. And in this novel of transformations, the characters make momentous changes to their lives because they don't fit in, and the consequences then come smashing back upon them like a wave. There are just two parts of the novel that I have some issue with. The last third of the book hinges on a very large and problematic coincidence. And the other issue that we might get into more next week when we talk about this in depth was the presence of Reese, the transgender character, which I think detracts from the novel.
If we're talking about the same coincidence, it did definitely feel like a pretty big coincidence, but I suspended my disbelief and moved on, especially because they don't focus on the coincidence itself. It just happens and we move past it.
This is something we've talked about quite a bit on our show, whether or not coincidences are good and how many coincidences are okay. Sam, you had mentioned that quote from Ha Jin. Basically, one coincidence is okay, more than one is not okay. So I think that in this novel, the one coincidence is okay because coincidences are real life. And in the novel, we have some characters who are motivated to uncover secrets. So because they're motivated to uncover secrets, the uncovering of the coincidence is more acceptable than it would be otherwise. It's not just happenstance.
Yeah, I think it's okay. It doesn't sink the novel, but for me, it makes it not perfect, which is a really high bar, because in my mind, very few novels are perfect in such a way that I would say, that doesn't lose me at all. So for me, the big coincidence is only problematic in that it makes the book not perfect in my eyes. I think a big reason why is because the first quarter of the book is centered on this question, this mystery. And then that mystery is solved with a coincidence. It's kind of deflating.
I mean, for a novelist, that's the hard thing to do. Creating tension and kind of tying the knot is the easier part, but untying the knot in a satisfactory way is the hard thing to do. And using a coincidence can feel like cheating, especially if it's done in a careless way.
I know what you mean. I think, like I said, I found it okay. Like, I was able to keep on moving. I didn't put the book down in disgust and say like, oh, you've lost me. I just thought that, it's a bit disappointing that Bennett was able to do everything so well up to that point. And then just like, oh, this happened. And I was like, oh man, it's kind of a bummer.
That's an interesting point because one of the things I wanted to mention was that at the very beginning of the novel, I expected this to be more plot-driven, more about how Early is sent by Desiree's husband to find her when she returns to Mallard. And I thought this was going to be, especially the more we learn about Early and Jude, I thought this was going to be more of a hunt in some fashion. And it is, but it didn't revolve around the hunt itself, if that makes sense. It was much more character driven, which is great. It made for good writing. But it is interesting that they don't focus on that hunting, which maybe could have been better worked in to the story in order to make that coincidence not a coincidence.
It only stands out in my mind because of how good she is at landing all of the other elements in the novel, like almost perfectly. Great images, solid sentences, compelling characters, interesting ideas. Like everything is there, except the plot every once in a while makes you kind of think like, okay, well, I guess the story has to go on. So that was the only thing. I think if it was more flawed, then maybe we wouldn't even be talking about it. But because so many things are done well, and this is the only thing that kind of stuck out a bit, that's why I'm nitpicking it, I guess.
I'm really surprised that this even rises to the level of nitpicking for you guys, because to be honest, in this novel, we're following this family for almost half a century. And we see so much of their lives that for something like this to happen, it's a once in a lifetime event. It is a rare event, but these things do happen. I think it's understandable. I don't think it's a problem for me at all.
Yeah, I think it's because I had some expectations, like Sam said, of it being kind of a hunt. And it was kind of resolved pretty early on, pun intended, where Early says he tried and that he couldn't find anything. Well, he just found out that she went to Boston for a little bit, and that was it. But I was kind of hoping that that would continue, and then to have it kind of resolved in such a way where it's like, well, the hunt didn't even matter. It's just a bit deflating, I guess.
I guess for me, it is deflating if you're expecting a more active way of people moving through their lives and achieving their aims. But for me, it was actually more realistic in that you'll often discover things without looking for them, and you'll often resolve problems without trying to resolve them. I think for me, it wasn't a problem because it's much less of a kind of an adventure story or a hunting story, as you guys are saying, and much more character driven. And I think that makes it much more rewarding.
Oh, it's definitely much more rewarding that way. I was just pleasantly surprised when it changed from what I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, the characters were really good in this book. I mean, that's what carries the whole novel. Everyone was really interesting, well fleshed out, very compelling. I legitimately cared about every single person in the story.
I did too. At least I did for all the characters you see significant amounts of. There are some you just get glimpses of, like, well, the white characters, but they're not really all that important.
I didn't care so much about Adele. Adele is the grandmother of the family. I didn't find her problematic, and I didn't find her to be an especially flat character, but she wasn't compelling. I didn't need to know much more about her.
Oh, I thought she was pretty interesting, especially near the end. I thought that was pretty interesting. This goes to show how little I actually remember about him, but I thought the only character who was maybe a bit disappointing was Stella's husband.
I thought he was going to be in it a lot more than he ended up being.
Yeah, it's just kind of almost a caricature in a way, and I guess it's okay, but I don't know. He's important because he's one of the few white characters in the book, and kind of just like a clueless white guy, right? It was a bit disappointing in how flat he was. But that's okay. He's not a very important character, I guess.
No, and I feel like he serves his purpose.
That's the problem. He's very functional.
Yeah, I guess so. I think he might come up more in our discussion next week.
What I'll say for a flat character is a character doesn't have to be rounded as long as there's nothing in his characterization that feels patently false. And while he is particularly flat compared to the others, there was nothing that seemed off about him. He seemed just like a kind of well-meaning but somehow clueless sort of white figure on the periphery.
Maybe I shouldn't say this because it's outside reading, but I was going to reference her article He's the, what's our article called? Like all the good white people?
It's I don't know what to do with good white people.
Yes. And he strikes me as that kind of character. He's the good white person. I mean, he's like mildly racist, but it seems to be par for the course for when that story was set, or when that part of the book was set, like in the 70s, 80s, right? He's mildly racist, but he's actually much more moderate than a lot of the peripheral white people in the book.
Right. He's still guilty of casual racism, but he will at least talk to people of color.
Yeah. Yeah, make corny jokes.
As long as they're famous.
We've been talking a lot about characterization. I think characterization is definitely one of the strong points of the novel. For me, one of the weak points of the novel is the pacing. I thought the plot was interesting, but I found maybe the first quarter of the novel to be a little bit slack. It took a while for me to get engaged with it. And then maybe the last 10% of the novel was also a little bit slack, in that there were points at which I thought the novel could have ended, and then there was another chapter added. I felt like Bennett didn't know when to quit. She didn't know exactly when enough was enough.
Ooh, I'm going to hard disagree with you. I thought the pacing and the format was really good. I was totally with it. I didn't have that reaction at all.
The format is fine. It's the pacing. We can talk more about specifics. I don't want to get into any spoilers here, but there is a substantial event at the end of the novel. And after that event, I think that most of the strings have been tied up. And then there is a little bit more of kind of a resolve that I think could have been cut out. It's unnecessary.
I agree that it slows down at the end, and I think I know what you're referencing. I do agree that it did feel like an epilogue of sorts, like a where are they now kind of thing.
Even if it were written as an epilogue, if she gave it that title, that would have been slightly better because it would have shown to the reader the purpose.
Oh, see, I disagree.
Well, it would have been better to cut the whole thing entirely, in my opinion, but if you're going to include it, I think it's better to give it a heading that indicates more clearly what kind of content it is.
I think that's true for some books. I don't think it would serve this book well. Even though I didn't love how it slowed down at the end, I actually didn't have a problem with that either. I really liked early, so having that little bit of resolution was okay for me.
What about the beginning of the novel? For me, the problem with the beginning of the novel is that it jumps into the return of Desiree to Mallard, but I feel like I wasn't engaged in the community or engaged in Desiree as a character enough. I feel like some scaffolding would have helped.
I had no issue at all. I was totally with it. I really thought everything here was really good. There was nothing in the novel that really pushed me out of it, especially at the beginning. I do agree with you, though, that I thought the ending, the very last image, the very last page, I thought it was like like not super strong, but I'm okay with it. So no issues for me here.
One of the things that gripped me right away, not in terms of pacing or action or anything, but I think it might even be the first page or second page. Right away, there's really good imagery. Some of the sentences, especially when it comes to color, are great. Like the first thing I wrote down was when she's describing, I believe it's the twins' skin color. She says that it's the color of sand barely wet. And there's another one just a few pages later that talks about how the twins' father, is it Leon? He's not in it very long. I think it's Leon. Anyway, she describes him as being pale as well, that on a cold morning, she could turn his arm over, she being Desiree, she could turn his arm over to see the blue of his veins. And there's a lot of attention given to color. Anytime color is described, it's described really well.
I do think that there is something to be said here about Brit Bennett's age and her prose style, because I think it's noticeable to me that she is a young writer and she has a young voice, but she has a very confident voice for a young writer. James, I remember in our episode about Kafka on the Shore, we were talking about that novel, and you said, this isn't the type of writing that an MFA student would come up with. When I read The Vanishing Half, I thought, this is the type of writing that an MFA student would come up with. Obviously, a very good MFA student, but it doesn't have that kind of surprise in it that I found in Kafka on the Shore, but not all novels need to surprise you in the same way. And with regard to her prose style, it was very confident in the sense that she knew when to stop describing things. I think for young writers especially, they're in love with the magic of description that they don't know when to stop. And I think with Bennett, the reason why this was such an easy novel to read is that she narrows in very quickly on the right image and then she stops describing.
I agree. I think she had a really great confidence in her style, and I'd really like to see more of that confidence. I'm sure she's going to be around for quite a while.
That's a bit dark. It's the kind of thing you might say if you're threatening somebody.
Would be a shame if something happened to you, Brit Bennett.
Yeah. All right, let's take a short break, and when we get back, we'll talk about our overall feelings about this novel. We're back. So I don't think I'm out of line when I say that all three of us really like this book, or at least all three of us thought that this book was very well written. Am I right?
I agree, yeah. I think that Brit Bennett is definitely a rising talent. It's very auspicious for a second novel.
Yeah, especially since a lot of second novels fall flat. Second novels often, people say, are cursed because they don't live up to the expectations that are set by a really good first novel. I didn't read The Mothers, but it sounds like this is even better work than The Mothers. Yeah, did you like this novel? Like, you found it interesting, but did you enjoy reading it?
I found it interesting. I enjoyed reading it. It's not the sort of thing that I naturally gravitate to just because it is so character driven and it's so socially themed. I tend to get interested in novels that are more formally experimental and adventurous, but I think it's definitely a good novel and definitely worth reading.
In some ways, and this is not a criticism, this is a book tailor-made for the Oprah book club, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and that's not a criticism. I mean, she has really good people working for her to select these books. So,
Whoa. Are you saying Miss Winfrey does not choose things herself?
you know, I actually don't know. I know people work for her and shortlist for her. I don't actually know if she picks the books herself.
I bet there's a mix. I bet she reads some herself, but I have a feeling she's got a good staff and that many of them are reading different things, pushing books toward her.
Is that who you would recommend this novel to?
To Oprah?
People, yes, Oprah, and people who would subscribe to Oprah or watch Oprah.
Yeah, but that's pretty narrow. I mean, she has a lot of readers and viewers, but that's a very narrow way of looking at it. I think I would recommend this, to most people in my life, actually. While I agree with Iad, it isn't going to be for everyone. It is more socially conscious and socially driven than a lot of people will like. But anyone that is open to those themes and open to those types of stories is going to enjoy this.
I think, honestly, the most controversial part of this book might be the transgender character.
Yeah, I think so.
Even so, I think that it's a novel of its time. Like, I think that American readers are ready to have that kind of character. 10 years ago, probably not. But right now, I think that readers are ready for it.
I actually found myself forgetting that he was transitioning, even though there are references throughout.
Yeah, I think I would recommend this novel to almost everyone, actually. I think of all the books that we've read so far, this book is the easiest for people to consume. And once again, it sounds like I'm criticizing it, but I'm not. It is a book that I think anyone can get into as long as they can read English.
It's not confrontational. It's not like Tommy Orange. I don't think everyone would fall in love with him just because he's very angry at times.
Yeah, and that is a very dark, depressing book, whereas this has sadness to it, but I would not call it a depressing book.
Do you think that this book is important enough to be taught in schools? Because certainly I think high schoolers can read it, no problem.
It has some very interesting themes, some very worthwhile themes that would be good in a high school setting.
I imagine this book being taught in the high schools of the future. Maybe not right now, but I think it will become one of those novels that high schoolers read because the school board chose it, because the school board wants to show how satisfied they are that so many social problems have been solved. You know, like this is this future generation's version of To Kill a Mockingbird or something. It's a pat on the back sort of novel. Assuming at least that all of these racial problems get solved in the future, at that point, that's when you'll find this on high school reading lists.
I could see a forward-thinking high school English teacher choosing this, at the very least putting it on a recommended book list that their students could pick from.
Yeah, I mean, I can see this being on book lists as early as next year for students. There's just so much here that is timely, but at the same time, like we said before, it really doesn't offend people in a way that would result in a lot of complaints. It's just so accessible. It's easy to read as well. Okay, let's conclude here. Thank you for listening. You can find our reading schedule on Reddit at Canonical Pod, where we also regularly post threads for discussion. We will have a thread up where you can join us and look at what questions we'll talk about for our episode next week, our in-depth discussion on The Vanishing Half. And we'd love for you to join us. You can also find us on social media at Canonical Pod. That's Canonical Pod, one word. So please go ahead and find a copy of the book if you want to join our discussion. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.